Whether you are the 22-year-old college student who is wondering how to best begin your career, the 40-year-old office worker who is afraid of striking out on their own, or anyone contemplating taking a chance at making their dreams a reality, stay tuned because this is a way to unlock a different path to success and the secret used by the top 1%. There are a few books out there where the concepts are so eye-opening and empowering that you wish you had read them earlier in life. Alex Banayan's book, The Third Door, Mindset of Success, is one of those books. Arden, for those not familiar with the book, how would you summarize it?
It's not that complicated, but he breaks it down into such easy way to digest. But at its core, it basically means that there's that first door. It's like whatever opportunity, whatever you're pursuing, it's that door that 99% of the people are trying to get into. If you think about it, it could be that line at the nightclub where everybody's lining, or the concert, like everybody's trying to get into that same door. That's the first door. Then you have the second door. And again, if I use the nightclub analogy again, there's that VIP door where people that are paying to get in, or celebrities and billionaires, that have some kind of status that gets them in. But then there's always that third door. And that third door is, using that same nightclub analogy, it could be behind the alley. It's a little underground stairs, a door you have to knock and give a passport to get in. It's basically that a creative approach to doing something that others are not actually thinking about. And that's the third door. And based on Alex's book, everything has a third door. If you just be persistent and look hard enough, you will eventually find a third door.
I love that way of putting it. And I will admit that while personally my clubbing days are, long behind me, if it wasn't for you, I probably would have been the guy who was waiting in line, but you showed me at least a VIP entranceway. But we rarely used that third door. It wasn't really a concept that we were thinking about as much, although
I used the third door. I did use the third door for the nightclubs because when we had the startup, which was nightlife focused, I started meeting all of the club owners because we were pitching to them. All of a sudden, I was not going into the VIP line. I was going to the owner's entrance. And that was the third door.
Actually, that's right. I also remember another time you found your way around it by promoting and planning your own club. When you that's another way in there. Okay, that's fair, and I think a really great point because as Alex begins his journey, basically while he was in college, he determined that he didn't necessarily want to be that med student that. He had a lot of pressure from his family and stuff to pursue. Within his culture, he mentioned that when you're, born, it's almost like, you're stamped with, okay, you're going to go off and get your, medical degree, or I don't know, it was also lawyer or others, but that was it for him. But while he was laying in bed one day, he mentions that suddenly he's like, gosh, this isn't really what he wanted to do. He thought about maybe switching over to business, but he thought, there are all these successful individuals out there. What if I could learn from them? What if I could document that? What if I could find out their secrets, their hacks? How did the top 1% get into their position? And from that, he decides to basically set a mission to start going around and meeting the variety of people, be it Bill Gates, be it Lady Gaga, be it Larry King, be it, Warren Buffett on his list, Jessica Alba. There were a bunch of individuals. And as he was going to go about that journey, he's like, okay, I got to do this. But the first thing he realizes is, oh, shoot, I don't have any money. And my parents aren't exactly supporting me on this adventure. In fact, they're not going to like it at all. So what do? Well, he gets passes for The Price is Right. And he manages to come up with a way. This was almost his first thinking into the third door mentality of, okay, how do I get picked? What is it that makes people more likely to get picked? And he started looking at the people he could, talk to who were going to make some of those decisions. And he also started looking at things like, okay, what are people wearing? How do you, show up loud, if you will, or at least enough to get the attention that you're picked? Sure enough, he was picked. He goes on Price is Right. He, by the way, never even had watched an entire show. And yet, somehow, he gets picked. He's up on stage. And luckily for the audience out there and a crash course he got from some people he was waiting in line with beforehand, he managed to actually win a big prize, which was a boat, which he then, or a yacht, or however you want to say, I guess somewhere in between. And he sells it for like $30,000. And that's what funds his mission. And I share that because one of the important elements he also mentions here that he learned along the way from one of his mentor is having a compelling story is one of these ways to be able to help getting somebody into the door. Because when you hear that somebody, like, eventually he actually drops out of school, or at least pauses it, and to pursue his dream and tell people that he also raised money by being on The Price is Right, you get people who are excited to try to figure out how they can help you because it's crazy enough that it's intriguing.
It's a great book. The other thing that is absolutely true, but I don't think a lot of people take advantage of, and the way he kind of shares this message is his story with Tony Hsieh, where he is kind of looks up to Tony and wants to interview Tony.
The founder of Zappos, for the
founder of Zappos, yeah, who actually unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. He finds his way into a room where Tony's there, then asks Tony, "I want to shadow you for a day." So ends up kind of walking around, going into all the CEO meetings with Tony, and then sees that some Zappos employees are giving him a dirty look. At the end, they ask him, like, how we've been wanting to shadow Tony. How did you do it? His response was, "I just asked." And then when he asked Tony, "Why don't you let your employees not shadow you?" His response is, "They don't ask." So it's this easy thing of just ask, because you never know. And there's this serendipitous things that can happen when you ask, because you never know what the other person has in mind as well, which is another story he tells of how a mentor of his, somebody that became a mentor of his, had actually set a goal that year to mentor somebody. He had no idea about that, but because he asked, it just happened. Sure, you could say it was luck, but I think it's more than luck. It's actually positioning yourself in those moments and situations where I think there's a concept of a luck surface, right, Mike? Like, you improve your luck surface by asking, you never know what can happen. And for, like, whether entrepreneurship, you're asking for that sale or that pitch, or even if it's a career side of things, you want to ask for that promotion. You won't know until you ask. So just ask.
And that promotion, that mentor, whatever it might be, the raise, because I love that story in there, and I almost saw it coming because I'm like, I bet you this, because so many people don't. And we face this a lot as leaders. It's like, at times you're like, gosh, we tried to make ourselves very accessible, and we would love to give anybody an opportunity if they came at it. But some people don't. And it makes you wonder, like, when you, with this section in the book about how many of those people, like, you almost assume, well, they must not want it. But actually, in many cases, it might just be that they're just too afraid to ask. So that was a super powerful moment. Another one that he talks about in there that I love, and actually, before I go there, just to emphasize that one more time, I think the idea of putting yourself out there and making sure also that people are aware of what you want is key. And I think that's what also helped him along his way, as he kept meeting with different people and telling them, sure, granted, some of his mentors are like, you got to hear this guy's story and his mission, and he went on The Price is Right. Like, that helped, as a unique enough story that got him listened to. But every time he would say it, so many people would be like, oh, well, I know somebody who knows, Tim Ferriss, or who knows, Spielberg, or any of those. And, maybe I can at least help to open that door up for you. And again, you got to put yourself out there, and you got to follow through with it, as I think is the other thing. Because I've seen a couple people on LinkedIn, as one example, who've basically, made a comment of, oh, how do I get a mentor in this space? And I literally, saw that, responded back, and said, hey, I'm happy to help. And sometimes I say DM me, or sometimes I'll just DM them. But I got to say, sometimes they don't actually follow through with that thing. So I think that's this other gap, maybe a point for another conversation. But people do need to have enough of a hunger and follow through with it. And I think an example that Alex shares in there is with one of those, that mentor, the one you shared that was also looking for somebody to mentor. That guy tells him last minute, he's like, hey, so we're going to be taking a trip, to Europe, or I think it was out to London or something like that. He goes, you cover your flight to London, I'll cover the hotels, everything else while you're there. What do you think? And like, for Alex at that time, he's like, he was on the fence. He knew, how his family would react and everything, but he did it. And this is like another important element of this book, is the idea of, adventures happen to those who are willing to be adventurous, and you need to be bold and you need to take those risks. And going out there really set him up with this mentor and started getting him introductions to others, because along the way he met so many individuals who now were going to have some of the connections he needed later as well.
It's perfect explanation of getting out of your comfort zone. Because I think when you hear people say get out of your comfort zone, this is exactly what it means. Because if you try to get through the third door, you have to get out of your comfort zone, because you're going to have to be doing things that you're probably not comfortable doing. And what's really cool about it is, sure, we say that this is the secret of the 1%. It might sound like, what secret is this? But it actually is, because if you name anybody super successful, you're gonna hear a story like this from them. I mean, he shares some of them in the book, whether it was Spielberg, finding his way to the Universal lot and becoming the youngest Hollywood, studio director, and the stories go on and on. So sure, it might not be a secret per se, but it is the secret. It's the hack that all these successful people use. So now you have to figure out, what are you trying to accomplish, and how do you find your hack? Because if you are in the same line as 99% of the other people, it probably might not happen. So you got to get creative.
You'll spend your life waiting in line. And I mean, I could say this from, our own experience, because there's some things I could look back at now. I mean, you and we early on started writing screenplays, but getting those screenplays in front of people. Now we did a few different, times, but it was one of those where it's almost like we were waiting in line, waiting for a turn instead, which is ridiculous now as I, think about some of that. And just taking it back to Spielberg's story for a minute. I mean, yeah, he ended up, getting off a tour bus at Universal backlot, and then meeting, if you will, this is another concept Alex talks about, is inside man. Somebody inside the company that, turns out that Spielberg met the right person who then, in essence, almost took him under his wing, because first off, this is something that people do. I don't want to say take a bias, but when people can see some of themselves in this individual, and this is why sometimes, you don't have to be younger, but sometimes when you are that college student or somebody straight out of that college, whatever it is, as long as somebody could see some of themselves and want to find a reason to help you, I think it's super beneficial. But Spielberg's story is he would leave from that tour, wave at the guy at the front each time he went out, and then the guy just assumed he must be like the son of some, famous, director, producer, or studio executive there. And then he started doing that every day, and, eventually even puts his own little plaque on the door that says Spielberg. But through this, it wasn't just that. He had his inside man, but he did also happen to create a short called Amblin that showed off his quality of filmmaking that was able to get him a job in directing.
That's the follow-through.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think the inside man piece is pretty critical, and it's something that Alex uses throughout, and that's often a way into that back alley door that you described, because when you know somebody who can at least get you closer to the other person, that's pretty critical as well. And how do you reach out to them?
Yeah. I mean, I'll share a personal story of mine where I thought about it that, oh, wow, I used the third door too. I just didn't know it until I read the concept like this. But before I share the story, what's interesting is when people are helping Spielberg or we're helping Alex, is that he was young. He was 19, 20, 21 doing this, and Spielberg are on the same age. There's this really interesting thing that happens with society where, based on your age, there's some things that you should be doing and you should not be doing. Not in a way of like, don't commit crime, but it's like, you're so young. How could you do this? I think if people take advantage of that, I wish I had known this when I wish I had consciously known this when I was in my 20s, because I used it. I just didn't know what I was using. But if you're 20, you should not be interviewing Bill Gates. But if you are, it's like, wow. But if you're 45 and a successful, semi-successful business person, and you get an interview with Bill Gates, like whatever. But there's something about a 20 or so. Finding a way to take advantage of where you are in your life and what people don't expect you to do. And if you do that, people will reach out to help you.
What I think is interesting with that, because I know in a previous episode when we were talking about mentorship, and we said, all right, people probably shouldn't go after Bob Iger to be their mentor. I think what's key around some of this stuff, and that what really helped Alex too, is he had a mission, and eventually this led to a book. So his thing had this purpose that also I think made it resonate more in society, because there might be people right now who are getting that meeting here, meeting there, but it's also how are they taking advantage of, where are they going with it? And one thing that's great about this book is you see along the way, Alex butchered some of these meetings that he had. In fact, he's fortunate he was able to get, but he distills those lessons that he had and acknowledges and moves forward. And I say that also because, look, sometimes whoever we find in life, maybe the first one doesn't work out exactly the way that we'd hope, but the key is to then, take those lessons and then move forward to, apply those in whatever the next situation is, versus what a lot of people do, which is, well, that didn't work, I'm never doing that again. So what's your story?
My story. So when Michael and I went to film school together, and, part of the film school and a graduation was you either have to produce your own film or work on somebody else's. Back then, this is a long time ago, almost over 20 years ago. We're aging ourselves. Over that period of time, the school had like a grant where they funded 5 or so projects. My project was one of them, and Michael's was one of them. So we got a grant from the school to actually produce this. So I go off, I have a script, and we start shooting. We're all students, so obviously, and this is during the film era. So I wish I was in film school during the digital era, but it was a film era. So we're shooting on 6mm film. It was a 3-day shoot. We go and process the film, and then we look at the film. Day 3, complete trash. So the cinematographer for day 3 just didn't put the film in correctly, and I don't know exactly what happened, but it was trash. We had to redo day 3. But the way film rentals work, film equipment rentals work, was you don't rent it just one day. It was like 1 week rental. So whether I had a 1-day shoot or a 5-day shoot, didn't matter. That was about $1,500 or $2,000. Then I needed more film, and that was another like $1,500, $2,000. I'm a student. I did not have that much money. I did not come from a wealthy background, so I couldn't ask my parents for that. So I thought about how am I gonna get this? I was interning at Sony at the time, so I had a Sony email address. Like, you know what? Maybe I should use this to my advantage. This is 2000, 2001. MGM's CEO back then was an Armenian executive. And back then, MGM Studios was owned by Kirk Kerkorian, who also, owned MGM, the Grand, the casinos and that before, obviously, Amazon now owns MGM. I'm like, you know what? Maybe I could use the Armenian connection here and make something happen. I find his email address, sent him an email from my Sony email. I thought maybe if it's a Sony email, they take it more seriously instead of like a Hotmail email. A week goes by, nothing. Week 2, I get an email back from his assistant saying that they got your email. If you can come in and meet with a producer. I was like, oh my God. Got invited to the Century City MGM building. I go up to I think it was 11 and 12 stores, the 12th story. And it was 1 story instead of 2 because that had high ceilings, and it was stairs that would go up to the executive floor and all the MGM Oscars set aside. So I walked up this amazing staircase, walked into this producer's office, and just tell him who I am. He's like, yep, the CEO told me that you reached out for some film. Well, tell me exactly what you needed. So I told him the story. Within 45 minutes, he makes a call. He's like, go meet this person. They'll give you all the film you want. I ended up getting all the film I wanted, plus more that way. And it's just it's a third door. I didn't know I didn't know that I was finding a third door back then. But now I know that looking back, that was a third door that I got into because I got creative and how to find an inside person to then talk to the right person.
I love it. And actually what it starts making me think a little bit more about too, where, if you look at a lot of successful people out there, a lot of them are investors. And what this, or rather Yeah, I mean, you could say that, but a lot of them use other people's money when they're investing as well. So your concept here, what you described, is at times that's the other thing. Just how do you connect with the people who have the money, which then lets that person grow out their own portfolio of success without any of theirs because they leverage somebody else's because they connect with the right people who they also knew that they could help. So just thinking about that connection in there. I admit, film school for me, I did at least reach out. For me, it was sending letters to the different providers of camera equipment, and eventually had Ari offer to provide us one for the weekend period or whatever we need for free. So I think there's these scenarios where people definitely, they want to help. It feels good to help. It gives them significance when they're able to help, and that's why people just can't be afraid. Worst case, you get a no, but you never know what it turns into. And this is why I think it's also valuable when people do put out there a little bit more of their goals. But I think taking it back to Alex's thing, when they could put it out there in a way that ties this mission to it, is going to help get more support.
And you touched on this earlier too. When you're reaching out to people, having a compelling story and a purpose behind where you're reaching out makes a difference. If you're just reaching out for the sake of reaching out and saying, I want to pick your brain for some advice, it's not going to work. That's just not compelling enough, because that person is probably getting 1,000 other emails in the same way.
Depending on that level, you might get that, for somebody, who knows, maybe you and I would still be like, okay, we'll hear you out. But yeah, as soon as you start climbing up too much, or people who are, VIP, it's too difficult. They have to manage their priorities. They don't mean to be rude about it, but it's kind of like one of his stories in there with Warren Buffett. He was trying so hard to get Warren Buffett, but Warren Buffett he can't. The number, I think, his secretary said something like he gets 100 or assistant, like 100 requests a day come through there. So it's so hard for him to do it. Now, at least Alex, I think in one case got supposedly a written letter back, which, may or may not have been because he was connected by somebody who then, did so. But he tried some creative ways too. He even sent a shoe to the, I think, assistant, basically saying he's just trying to get a foot in the door, or, whatever it is. And I think you do have to look at how you can be creative, and taking it back to our background in Hollywood too. This was one of the things with screenwriting they talk about is, granted, there's a process, the wait in line process, where you submit, and, you technically it's hard to get an agent because you can't get an agent until, they've read your work, but nobody wants to read your work unless you have an agent. So you're like, what do I do? So you have to find creative ways sometimes to get seen. And for Alex, he shared a couple of other stories there, and one of them was he couldn't get his meeting with Tim Ferriss, where he struggled with it at one point, and I could be getting this a little bit reversed, but he ends up actually waiting outside of something where Tim Ferriss was presenting, and literally hiding in the bathroom, waiting until he heard that Tim Ferriss was wrapping up so that he could serendipitously run into Tim Ferriss in the hallway, and at that point introduce himself, which helped to kind of get him there. But he learned an important lesson too, though, because he then kept being so persistent with him that persistence can be good, but as he also acknowledged, like Tim Ferriss almost didn't ever even meet with him. Now, you could argue and say, but he did. Was it the persistency? And I think it was because of this connection in person that they happened to know, because otherwise Tim Ferriss was also kind of like, dude, you need to back off. And there was a few other examples of that in the story. So I think you have to find the right approach, and you can't be too aggressive with it. And this is where, if you can find that inside person and, be tenacious but not annoying, is another critical thing he learned in his journeys as well.
There's a fine line. You can get persistent. As soon as you cross the line, you're annoying. But it's like you have to know where that line is. What helps you be aggressive is knowing that inside man. That helps you be more aggressive. But if without that inside person, you can easily come off annoying if you don't play your cards right.
Absolutely. And I think, kind of an important thing that he also looks at is, whenever you're facing an obstacle, but just remembering that there's always another path waiting to be discovered. So no does not mean no. No means no, not this way, but maybe another way. And taking it back to my own third door example, again, although I wouldn't have thought about it or named it that at the time, one that got us both into Disney is when I happened to sell shoes to somebody who was, a manager there at the time. I don't even think he's but a manager there at the time. And she paid with her credit union card. And I'm like, well, what do you do? And she's like, the world. I'm like, what do you mean? The group was Worldwide Technical Services. And and she offered to pass my resume in. Now, I may have found the key to her heart in shoes because she loved the shoes, but obviously I also went out, asked the question, at which point I was able to start temping there in a position because she's like, look, your resume is pretty impressive. But the problem was, and this is going back to that whole thing when people are looking for jobs to see who you know, and you and I did a whole nother episode on this about how you get yourself in front network, because once more, again, not having called it that before, in many ways, what we're suggesting to people is the third door. Don't do the one where you're waiting in line like everybody else. Too many people are like, let me just apply for this job. And I don't know why I applied for 50 jobs now and I've only heard back from 2. Because you're waiting in line. You're using the waiting in line technique. You have to use, the third door. And I don't know, maybe the VIP, I'm trying to think if we call it something else there. Maybe that's when maybe that's knowing the recruiter. Although recruiter might be a third door in general too. But the idea is that got us in. That then landed us these positions. Eventually, we spent the time at Disney. So I think just another example, and you got to be willing to ask. But you also need to, again, ensure how you follow through on it, get you to the outcome that you're trying to do.
Is there, I know we already kind of talked about some of Alex's stories from the book. Do you have a favorite?
Well, the Lady Gaga one's pretty amazing, but I'm just going to tease that one and say people should, they should listen or read the book in general, but just kind of how the accumulation of all of his lessons, because this is one of the last stories in there, was pretty powerful. But I also, so many of them resonate. It's hard to say. Like for me, being a Spielberg and a Tim Ferriss fan, like both of those were really key to me. His Jessica Alba one I thought was really amazing as well, because he was going through this point in his life at that time, with his dad, if I'm not mistaken, right, and his dad's health and stuff, that he just had this aha moment of what he was realizing, and what he realized by Jessica Alba as she started her company, this huge driver for her, and why this became so critical to her own future, and it became her own story. And, now she runs it's $1 billion, company over there, which is pretty incredible. So honestly, it's so hard to pick one. I mean, he had this aha moment with Jane Goodall as well, when it came to how he was approaching the men versus the women interviews. And so, yeah, honestly, I'm struggling to pick a favorite. And I saying one more, Steve Wozniak is another one in there. And that one was it shows you that sometimes people, the 1% they might be looking for isn't like what the Steve Jobs might have been looking for with what he was building in a company and the billions the company was worth. For Wozniak, in many ways, it's just happiness. And that in its own right, you could argue is a 1% thing to strive for, because a lot of people out there are chasing happiness, don't have it. And Wozniak actually feels like this type of guy who is there in his own right. So how about you as I spill out all these stories?
No, I'm
great too.
It's hard to pick one, but for kind of personal reasons, because of podcasts, one that stands out with me is his Larry King story, because he's basically trying to ask Larry King interviewing advice, which was, got my attention, because that's what we've been doing over the past few months. So I was very keen to know, how do you become a better interviewer? So that one stood out to me. But I'm with you. His stories are brilliant. And I think because the book is filled with so many stories, is why it got national attention and a lot of praise.
Eventually, while we didn't get Alex on for this episode, Alex, it is our goal. We will have you on here. The podcast, in many ways, for us, has become a bit of a third door, because we've been able to start getting conversations and meet people that otherwise might not have had the time and day for us. So that's another thing that's, kind of interesting there. It's taken us time to build it up. But as now we reach over 1,000, subs and some of our guests, hitting, I think recently 17,000 views, it's like, oh, okay, now we have something that gets people's attention, and then, with our story and mission as well there, it helps, I think, to unlock more of a third door for us. I'm excited to see where that
We have a story and a purpose, so it helps. Yeah. Well, I think we should wrap it up. Just as a takeaway.
I have one more question for you. Sorry. Do people, because what we're talking about here in many ways is kind of, I don't want to say break the rules, but find a way around the rules. So I'm curious, do people who don't follow the rules have more success?
100%. I would say without a doubt, I don't even have to think about that answer. Now, when we say break the rules, we're not saying commit a crime, but rules are just guidelines made by people before you. So break those rules. They're not in stone. Don't commit a crime, because that's a different story. But just general rules around how to approach things. Yeah, people that break the rules are kind of those trailblazers and pioneers that create new rules because they broke the old ones. So 100%, I say yes to that question.
I'm with you. And yeah, there's this last kind of story that I had listened to. I don't think this one was in the book, but it was in one of Alex's I don't know, podcasts or one of his presentations he did. But and it kind of summarizes a lot of what I think a message he was trying to get to a lot of people in this book, which is it being about possibility and looking at life as possibilities. And if you could change somebody's beliefs to possibility, they will never be the same. And his book really strives to do that. As you see each time, he either breaks through a barrier, or you see how he's able to get through, this third door. And there was a story that he had shared about a kid in a classroom, and it was a classroom full of kids, and the teacher gave the assignment, I believe it was to draw out their vision, do a drawing that kind of shaped the future, how they see themselves. And all of the kids got to drawing, but there was this one kid who just kind of sat there, and he wasn't. And the teacher took notice of this, but eventually about halfway through the class, this kid finally started drawing something. And she's like, okay, great. So afterwards, she's reviewing all the drawings, and she noticed that this kid had drawn a picture of basically a pizza delivery guy, which when we think about a vision of our future, that's often not what, many of us would think about. So the teacher actually talked to the mom about it. And she's like, I just want to make sure you're aware of this. And this was really odd. And the mom's like, I'm not surprised. I guess it turns out that everybody in this kid's life had been involved in drugs or other, questionable activities. And his uncle was a pizza delivery guy and was that one sort of piece of inspiration that he had in life. So in this moment when he was asked to think about that future, that's what he saw. And Alex points out that people will only reach for the highest branch they think is possible. So ultimately, it's our job to illuminate more branches for the individual, and he sees it as his job. And for you and I, that's a big thing that we're trying to do, because our mission is to empower people to know more, do more, and be more. And that story just really stuck with me, because I think it's something we can all do a better job at. And especially, again, when I hear that story about that kid, it just resonates with me, because, you can't imagine, because we all just want our kids to be able to reach, for the stars. And that was an incredible story that he didn't think to the stars yet, because he hadn't been opened up and enlightened in that way.
He didn't know the stars existed.
Right. Yeah, exactly it. So any other parting words from you?
No, just make sure you pick up the book, because it's amazing. And then comment, share, let us know what you think about this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.
Love to hear about anybody's third doors in the comments too. Like, what third doors have you taken in life? You never know. It might inspire some others to try to consider using a similar door. Take care, everyone.